Um, okay, well, we will be taking questions and answers at the end of the sessions, but for now, we will move on to the second set of presentations, which I'm going to present on profitability, boosting capacity, achieving efficiencies in the shift to e-commerce fulfillment, for which we have a few slides. Going to look at the backdrop to COVID and to COVID-19 and where we have effectively come from with e-commerce, the change in shopping habits that we've all experienced either as consumers or within the business, what the pre-COVID impact was, the effects of the pandemic itself, how the supply chain has reacted to that, and this subject of the new normal. We're also going to look at opportunities in the built environment for warehousing structures for those that are looking to improve their operations and to accommodate some changes into their strategy going forward. And a little bit of a glimpse of the future, perhaps in terms of retail as well. So the second slide, this is a little dated, this slide, but it is the latest slide available from the Centre for Retail Research. The reason I've put this one in is because I think it's important to understand the journey that we've been on in the development of e-commerce and online sales. It's very often not appreciated just where the UK sits in relation to the rest of the world, and particularly the rest of Europe. We have always been out front in terms of that volume of online sales. Online retail has come pretty much from nowhere in 15 years. If you think back that far, we had mail order, we had some catalogue shops, but that was about it. If you can see now, by the end of 2019, we were trending at 20% of our retail spend being online transactions. And this was twice the European average. So it's quite significant where the UK sits in relation to the rest of Europe. Let's move on to the next slide. There have, of course, been some retail casualties, even before lockdown, even before the impact this year of COVID-19. We were seeing some retail casualties coming from the high street, from footfall retailing. And in fact, the figures for year to date up to June shows, and there are some of them, 40 companies, many with very long histories of shopkeeping, retailing, here in the UK. 40 companies went into administration. Fortunately, quite a number of these have been saved. But that affected 2,630 stores around the UK and very directly 56,000 employees. And some of these companies, despite having quite a lengthy trading history, had, as Stuart had alluded to, come to online platforms quite late, and perhaps didn't have quite the same attractive platforms and offerings as some of the others that have been successful in moving forward. So it's been a particularly tough time before we get anywhere near the impact of a pandemic. I was asked, very fortunately, and nice to be, to present at the United Kingdom Warehousing Association National Conference back in March, beginning of March, and presented on the subject of compliance. We'll actually be hearing a bit more about compliance from Miles a little later on this afternoon. But at that time, the graph that you see at the bottom was showing the already impressive growth in online sales here in the UK. There's a graph that shows over the past 5 years, up to the end of 2019, where we just tipped 20%. that 20% trend line would take us, we figured, through to 2025 to reach 30%. Online shopping having reached 20% of total retail spend, it was estimated meant that almost 76% of the UK population were regular online e-shoppers. We also had presenters at the United Kingdom Warehouse Association conference this year from the property sector who had projected, just to satisfy the needs of online, we would require another 44 million square feet of warehousing here in the UK to satisfy the growth line that you see there in red. What we weren't prepared for was the impact of COVID, which I'll demonstrate to you as we go through. So that pre-COVID impact was seeing an enormous impact there on the high street. Many stores, as we've seen, going into liquidation, boarded up. It was the largest fall through March itself, the largest fall in retail volumes per se, not just online, but retail volumes per se, as people became hesitant about the oncoming pandemic. We saw a 5.1% fall in retail volumes per se for that month. And many of those stores had already ceased trading before the 23rd of March, when government guidance took us into lockdown. Online sales, however, by the end of March had picked up, and 22.3% increase in the 1 month alone. And this is the result of where we've got to with the pandemic. As you can see, just those last 5 weeks, leading up through April and May, from the end of March through to the first week of May, the equivalent growth compared with the previous trend line would have taken 5 years. We actually exceeded that 30% figure, up to 32.8% in just 5 short weeks. Incredible. Nobody's ever seen anything quite like it. A number of my clients were reporting their orders at 300% above anything they had experienced in previous years at Black Friday or Christmas peak events. The impact of that and the strain on their supply chains and their ability to service orders of that sort of level was quite astonishing. But of course, bricks and mortar retailing businesses are still propped up by furlough payments. Lots of those that went into lockdown obviously furloughed their workforce, or a predominance of their workforce. So we haven't as yet seen the full impact, and we won't see the full impact on bricks and mortar retailing that was already quite stressed until we get through the furlough period. So we should expect another rise in business failures potentially in the autumn. And there have been challenges keeping workers safe, as Stuart alluded to, the things that we've needed to put in place to make sure that people were socially and operationally distanced in the workplace. Other things that have been important have been businesses needing to review their health and safety policies, and also to ensure that their risk assessments were compliant and underpinned their health and safety policies in the light of the COVID-19 restrictions. So what have been the implications on supply chains? We are a net importer in the UK. We are heavily dependent upon international supply chains. Some of those activities, we've seen obviously a dip in supply because of the rollout of impacts elsewhere in the world, 6 to 8 weeks ahead of us. We've also seen a demand for off-dock storage backed by the government. It's always essential in these situations where you think there's going to be a stuttering supply chain to make sure that our ports remain fluid. The prospect of having congested ports is not something we would wish to experience. So I'm aware of having been involved myself in finding a series of locations for laden containers to be stored around the UK up to 20,000 containers that would provide that relief for the ports. Also a requirement to provide lay-by for cross-channel ferries, car ferries, and some of the freight ferries whilst they were not being used. Also a requirement for temporary warehousing. Not possible to satisfy the needs of everything coming in on top of the Brexit stock that people were already holding. There have been a lot of warehouses brought back into being, become more viable, even as short-term lets. As I've mentioned, order volumes going up by, in certain cases, up to 300%, and resultant replenishment issues. So the new normal, I don't actually subscribe really to the word new normal, because I don't think we will know what normal is for some time to come, if ever. Normal is a strange word in supply chain. It can be difficult to envisage normal. We tend to be professional change managers. We're there to facilitate change, and very often to engender change in people's strategies. Life doesn't stand still long enough, be it technology or anything else, to know what normal actually feels like. But what we have had experience of, all of us, I suspect, is this increase of just in time, and whether that was to be the holy grail of the supply chain, or whether, as we find out, it's become an Achilles heel to us by virtue of the fact that we have very lean supply chains. We have repeatable services. The vessels that come into our ports these days have become considerably larger and deliver repeatable services. So we've become reliant on these services, which has enabled our customers to drive down their inventory and have less in reserve. I'm not so certain that will be the case in the future. If there is such a thing as a new normal, I think we may be looking at more of a balanced supply chain. The subject of nearshoring, not relying on everything coming from certainly from the Far East or from deep seas delivery. We will look very carefully at the sort of inventory. Our customers will look carefully at the sort of inventory that they suspect they need to hold in order to be able to service their supply chains and service their customers. And the question of multi-vendor comes back into the fray, because we really have to think about whether single sources of supply that carry such high risks are correct for us. The built environment has always had spec-built warehousing, and spec-built warehousing is nowhere near as readily available now as it has been in the past. As I said, we have a demand for online warehousing, which is quite significant, unlike anything we've seen previously. And the options are either spec-built warehousing or built to suit. Generally, the spec-built warehousing would be more readily available. It often involves older stock coming back on the market, and that's something which we're likely to see even more of, with tenancies failing as a result of COVID and a result of impacts elsewhere on the supply chain. Very often, spec-built warehousing has been located to suit B2B businesses and not necessarily B2C. When it comes to B2C, you don't have to be so specific about where your warehouse is located. Very often, these are first and second generation big sheds, and they've got very low roofs. The yard space too is often at a premium, not being built to accommodate vehicles in anything like the number that we have today, and particularly the couriers that weren't calling for B2B business. The alternative to that is built to suit warehousing, and my company does spend quite a lot of its time looking at built to suit warehousing, offering the solutions architecture services to customers in the e-commerce sector, looking at how we can design around their process. It's designed exactly around the client's operation, puts the client at the heart of the solution. And what we also emphasize is the third dimension. We're now looking with modern built-to-suit warehouses at 18+ meter heights. Not possible everywhere in the UK, I will appreciate. But in that, we have the opportunity to look at multi-level solutions. Mezzanines in particular, the use of conveyors. When the pick level is at SKU level and not at pallet level, it throws the whole question of warehouse design and warehouse suitability into the mix. We are designing buildings now with 25 kilonewton structural mezzanines that will support considerable weights on considerably less columns, and makes extremely good sense and better space in the warehouse. And flexible docking options will provide us with low-cost storage. It's an example of a spec-built warehouse for a client where we looked at the client's requirements very closely, looked at the process and designed around his process, and then effectively wrapped a building around the solution. Without doing the architect a discredit, the building is there just to keep the process wind and watertight. But some of the things that you will see featured there, where the columns come down through the building, they have a minimum impact on the storage space. We also have featured multi-deck mezzanines. So over the top of the dock levelers, the mezzanines take up that space that would normally be a massive void in the warehouse unused. All space that's being paid for. The other thing to bear in mind is that the costs, the principal costs for a warehouse, rent and rates payable, are essentially a two-dimensional charge. That third dimension of height does not increase necessarily your rates and rent. And a quick glimpse of the future. If we think about the retailing element for e-commerce, I've been involved in some discussions around what the future looks like for e-commerce collection points. And this is a edge of town shopping area, which is focused entirely around a collection and delivery point, which has with it, as you see, ample parking. It's also got recycling opportunities, so we are very concerned from a sustainable perspective about taking too much packaging, so the opportunity to leave behind the packaging. There are also fitting rooms involved with this because a lot of apparel is sold online, and here there's an opportunity to try on those garments. Very often people order more garments than they actually finish up with. It's far more cost effective and more sustainable to be able to get those back into the supply chain at the earliest opportunity. So if you only ever took away from the collection point the one item that you wanted, not the 4 you ordered, it would be a lot more sustainable solution. That would be packaged also together with other things that would make that sociable visit to this location better. Things like convenience stores, food outlets, and family dining, and coffee shops and so forth. So it's a more sociable event during which you can pick up anything from any of the platforms that have been delivered to a common point, and you have that ability to return goods whilst you're there. It's just a view of how we may see those shopping opportunities change as we move on into the future.